Good morning, everyone, and welcome to St. Paul's Sunday, the Feast of the Conversion of St. Paul, the day that we give thanks for the Apostle Paul and being his parish here in Alexandria. It's also the time we acknowledge and give thanks for the work of the St. Paul's Foundation and the incredible work that they do. I'll say more about that in my time, but I want to introduce the treasurer of the St. Paul's Foundation, Joe Thomas, who's going to speak for a minute about the foundation and how you can be part of it.
Thank you, Oran. On behalf of John Siegel, the Foundation's president, and myself, we're delighted to welcome you this morning. Thank you for coming, and I'd love to give a quick overview and update on the St. Paul's Foundation. I'm sure you know the foundation was established in 1992 to build an endowment whose primary purpose is the care, maintenance, restoration, and ongoing support and oversight of the grounds owned by St. Paul's Church. The foundation is governed by a board of trustees. We meet quarterly to discuss and monitor and direct the activities of the foundation. Foundation officers, as mentioned, are John Siegel, president, myself, treasurer, Suzanne Brock, our able secretary, and other trustees include Tim Adams, David Ayers, Tim Belovitz, John Kepler, Sarah Knutson, and Don Stump, and it is a joy to work with these talented professionals in the oversight of the foundation. At the end of the year, our foundation, we celebrate and stands at just under $6.8 million, which includes the main endowment, thank you, which includes the main endowment valued just under $5 million, added by the recent Simmons bequest, which is valued at just under $2 million. The trustees hire Links Investment Advisory to help us provide oversight and direction to the specific investment managers as fiduciaries for the foundation. The foundation directs 4.5% of the corpus of the foundation to support the ongoing work of St. Paul's Church. With the addition of the Simmons Fund beginning in 2022, proceeds from the foundation now not only provide ongoing maintenance to this beautiful campus, but also support the work of the Lazarus Ministry, the music ministry, scholarships to St. Paul's Episcopal Preschool, and the Cemetery Fund. Since 2017, the foundation and our endowment has distributed just over $1 million to the church. This amazing support has enabled a multitude of vital maintenance projects over this period of time. We work in close coordination with the vestry to determine the maintenance projects that are our highest priority. Over the past 2 years, you've seen this in action, as has included the restoration of the stained glass windows in the historic sanctuary, the complete replacement of the HVAC system in Wilmer Hall, and the painting and the lighting project completed in the sanctuary this past summer. This all is a function of the generous donations from parishioners, especially those in the Covenant Circle, which have helped grow the endowment from $100,000 when it was formed, as I mentioned, to over $6 million today. We encourage everyone to consider the Covenant Circle. The Covenant Circle is our vehicle and legacy society for those who've remembered St. Paul's in their will or in their estate plan. There's more information available on the website and in our bulletin today, and would commend you to give that every consideration as a part of your family's work. On behalf of the entire foundation, we thank you for your support. We thank you for coming today, and I'm sure we will all recognize we're among greatness in this burgeoning author, and we're so excited to hear more about the vision of Dr. Wilmers. Thank you, Oran.
Thank you, Joe. I add my thanks to all of you. It's quite an honor to present the 2023 Foundation Sunday Forum and to highlight the work of the Foundation. We're so grateful for their efforts to preserve and maintain our historic buildings, chief among them our beautiful church. I like to think that in spite of his initial misgivings, that Benjamin Latrobe would be pleased with us and the care that we have taken with his lovely creation. The St. Paul's Foundation and the St. Paul's Vestry, past and present, have formed an incredibly effective team. In addition to jointly supporting the overall mission and ministry of the church, they have done an amazing job being stewards of our properties, which are themselves resources for ministry. These properties exist to help us to do our work, to shape disciples, to worship God, and to serve the world in God's name. And the evidence of their good work is all around us, in the people and in the property. If you have not already done so, I encourage you to consider your own commitment to this ongoing work, particularly through your annual giving and by remembering St. Paul's in your estate planning. By doing so, you are supporting our critical common mission, both the present and the future. As the people of God in this place, we have been entrusted with the gift and legacy of faith, a gift and legacy for the present generation and for generations to come, as we strive to shine as a light in the world to the glory of God. I'm grateful to the vestry and people of St. Paul's, my colleagues Jenny and Elise, the parish staff, for affording me sabbatical time this past summer, which provided me with the opportunity to fulfill a long-time goal to write a biography of St. Paul's second rector, William Holland Wilmer. I'm pleased to report that with the help of archivist Corinne Marasco, I have handed off an edited manuscript to the publisher just this past week. So a few more steps in the process, but I certainly hope the book is published soon this year, and certainly before the October 15 date. Mark your calendars, October 15, 2023, the 200th anniversary of the founding of St. Paul's. It's not St. Paul's, the seminary, Virginia Seminary. So there's St. Paul's and the Virginia Seminary. You will all know that the first classes of the Virginia Seminary were held right here at St. Paul's, and Dr. Wilmer being the first professor at Virginia Seminary. He gathered 14 students in the room that in those days was called the vestry, which now serves as our chapel. That space has evolved and been reconfigured many times over the years for many purposes, but the original items are the fireplace and the mantle. If they could talk, the stories that they could tell us. The mission partnership between St. Paul's and Virginia Seminary began on that day and continues to the present. The seminary has recently honored this partnership by naming a large, beautiful space in the newly expanded and renovated VTS Deanery. They call that space the St. Paul's Library. Now, when you visit, you will immediately notice that the St. Paul's Library has no books, not one book. More akin to a presidential library, this lovely space will be used for public gatherings and events. The founding of VTS is only one piece of the story I plan to tell today, one piece of a much larger effort to establish the Episcopal Church in America, which was in its infancy at the time, very vulnerable, and to save the Episcopal Church in Virginia, which was near death. St. Paul's, this congregation, served not only as a local outpost of this larger movement that Wilmer and others were seeking to lead, but also Wilmer's base of operations. Now, the premise of this presentation today is that the core principles that Dr. Wilmer and others developed and followed to help address the challenges of the church in their day also have great relevance to addressing the challenges facing the church today. My aim is to examine Dr. Wilmer's vision in terms of its historical context and then in terms of our own. But first, let's begin with the word of prayer on this St. Paul's Foundation Sunday, and I hope you'll join me. The Lord be with you. Let us pray together. O God of all our years, look with favor and blessing upon us, the people of St. Paul's Church, as we give thanks for 214 years of ministry in your name, and for the ministry and witness of your servant, William Holland Wilmer, whom we remember this day. As you have guided us in the past, direct us boldly into your future. Grant us steadfast faith, so that we may have minds to know you, hearts to love you, and open hands to serve you. And in all we do, make us people mindful of your calling, to shine as a light in the world, to the honor and glory. Amen. So, saving the Episcopal Church, the vision of Dr. Wilmer and the work of St. Paul's yesterday and today. Let me be clear at the outset. Dr. Wilmer did not single-handedly save the church in Virginia or single-handedly establish the national church. Far from it. He was, however, a key and pivotal leader in both efforts. He was one of 4 leading reformers in Virginia and one of many on the national scene. And this does not even begin to acknowledge the countless numbers of men and women who gave themselves to this important effort. Let me also be clear that while I hold Dr. Wilmer to be among the great saints of the church, he was also, as he would be quick to confess, a fallible, imperfect human being. And there are at least 2 challenges in telling his story in the early part of the 21st century. The first is that Dr. Wilmer was an enslaver. He held human property. I do make the case in the book that he had an evolving consciousness on this topic and eventually made dramatic changes in his personal life, but those dramatic changes did not enter his public life. And to be clear, he was never an abolitionist. Secondly, and he would never use these terms to describe himself, but Wilmer was an Anglican evangelical. And to our modern ears, that sounds like an oxymoron. Both in terms of Anglican and evangelical. Both are problematic, confusing, and controversial terms in the present day. And at issue is essentially separating the historical movements from the current reality, current expressions, which are 2 very, very different things. The term Anglican still refers to that global community of churches that are connected by a common history and perspective. However, it is also the name chosen by churches that have officially separated and seek to differentiate themselves from the Episcopal Church in America as a result of recent and not so recent controversies that include prayer book revision, civil rights and racial justice, the ordination of women, our evolving understanding of human sexuality and identity. So today, when you call yourself an Anglican, which I proudly do, it usually requires some follow-up explanation. The term evangelical is probably even more problematic. Wilmer and his fellow reformers would have viewed their evangelical label in almost purely theological and personal terms, which of course would have clear social and political implications. The modern use of the term is the opposite. It's strongly, primarily associated with social and political attitudes. And to be fair, these attitudes may well be shaped by theological perspectives, but it would be a perspective that Wilmer and his colleagues would find confusing, if not unrecognizable. So today, to call yourself an evangelical, which I proudly do, it really requires further explanation. All of these topics are addressed in greater detail in the book, but alas, that's not our focus for today. So with all those caveats and provisions out of the way, let us now turn to Dr. Wilmer, who was widely known and recognized and renowned in his own day, but his story has been mostly lost or forgotten. I think it is a story that's worth our notice, and he has something to say to us today. So I'll take a quick look at Dr. Wilmer's timeline, and I do this, try to do it quickly, but for 2 reasons. First, to understand why his story was forgotten, or has largely been forgotten, and secondly, to give you a sense of the enormity of his contributions. So it all began in 1782 at White House Farm in Chestertown, Maryland. Wilmer's family came to Maryland in the 1600s. The original farm, now most of the town of Chestertown and the campus of Washington College were part of that White House Farm. He comes from a long line of Anglican evangelicals and clergy, and I could get off on a tangent here, but let me just say one thing, that there is, I have a colleague, Amy Wilmer, who's the rector of St. John's Church in Richmond, who is a direct descendant of William Holland Wilmer and still has the last name, which is amazing, and her church is less than a mile from where the Monumental Church, which I'll talk about in a minute, where Wilmer launched this great movement. So it's amazing. As my wife Barbara often says, it is a small little Episcopal world, and it is. Okay, move ahead to 1685. Now remember, the church was established in 1607, moved to 1785. New nation, it's time for the Diocese of Virginia to become organized. It's the first convention. It is presided over by the Reverend Dr. James Madison, whose older cousin and namesake would become president. He, at the time, is the president of the College of William and Mary. He presides over that first convention, and 5 years later, he's elected the first bishop of Virginia. He had 3 jobs. So he was the president of William and Mary. He was the rector of Bruton Parish and the Bishop of Virginia. And it was his work at the College of William and Mary that essentially provided his salary. So 3 jobs. And it's a traditional, very transitional period for the College of William and Mary, and it's interesting, there are parallels between the Diocese of Virginia and the ongoing development of the College of William and Mary, a whole chapter in the book. For the first many presidents of the College of William and Mary, all of them through William Holland Wilmer were also Anglican clergy. So let's go 1802. Oops. Good. 1802, Wilmer graduates from Washington College. His father was one of the benefactors and founders of Washington College, and he established it in the year that Wilmer was born. So he graduates from the college right there in his hometown. He initially starts a business career, eventually feels a call to the ministry, and he becomes an Episcopal priest. Something that's happening really importantly in this time is that in 1805, the status of the church was so low in Virginia that Bishop Madison steps away from his position as bishop. He doesn't resign, he just steps away, stops being the Bishop of Virginia. So between 1805 and 1812, things were so bad that there was not a single diocesan convention. There was no gathering of the people of the Diocese of Virginia, 1805 to 1812. So in 1809, Wilmer is ordained a deacon. In 1810, he is ordained a priest. He's ordained by Bishop Claggett, who's the first bishop consecrated on American soil. Another great, interesting story, but not for today. In 1811, William Meade was ordained. Bishop Madison ordains William and Meade in 1811. He was the first deacon, first of any ordination in 10 years that Bishop of that time for Bishop Madison. And he is one of the 4 reformers that I will talk about, Wilmer being one, Meade being the second, and he's incidentally the only Virginian in the group. Oliver Norris, also from Maryland, like William Holland Wilmer, and then the 3 of them will recruit the 4th member of their team, and will be the 2nd Bishop of Virginia, Richard Channing Moore, who's from New York. So that's the 4. 1812. St. Paul's calls William Holland Wilmer. He comes and is excited about being here. It's a pivotal year. So he comes to Alexandria. Bishop Madison dies the same year. And so these 3 leading reformers end up here in Alexandria. William Meade was the part-time rector of Christ Church, William Holland Wilmer here, and eventually Meade would handpick Oliver Norris to be his successor at Christ Church. And so the interesting there aside for us is that this is only 3 years after the congregations are separated, and now Oliver Norris and William Holland Wilmer are colleagues in the same time. They were friends. They were ordained together by Bishop Claggett, both as deacons and priests. The congregations almost immediately began working together on this great common mission that they had come to present. So also happened in that year that the 3 of them got the Diocese of Virginia back together. They sent out a circular letter, set out a date, gathered in Richmond in the Capitol building, and they tried to bring things together again. One of the things that happened in that convention is that Wilmer was elected to be the representative of the Diocese of Virginia to the General Convention. He would go to his first convention in 1814. He would attend 6 general conventions, and he would preside at 4 of them as the president of the House of Deputies, and he was 32 years old, so keep that in mind. He presented his first confirmation class here in St. Paul's in 1813. And since there was no Virginia bishop, he called his friend, Bishop Claggett from Maryland, to come and do that confirmation service. And again, it was a joint service, a large service between Christ Church and St. Paul's. And it was at this time that these 3 began writing letters, and they blocked one effort to elect a bishop of Virginia because they wanted the 4th member of their team. They knew it had to be a bishop. It had to be an evangelical bishop, and they worked really hard on getting Richard Channing Moore to say yes, and he was very smart about it. He loved being in New York, had grown 2 parishes to be enormous. He was very famous there. He refused to step foot in Virginia until he had a job that paid, until he was elected bishop. And so that he succeeded. So that gets us to the pivotal part of the story. So this is the Monumental Church in Richmond, and the building is still there. It's been engulfed now by VCU Medical Center, so it's right on Broad Street. In those days, it was Main Street. And it was built on the site of a devastating fire, a theater fire, on Christmas Day, and many, many people were killed, including the governor of Virginia and the president of the Bank of Virginia. And it was widely seen as an act of God's judgment, that people shouldn't have been at the theater anyway. So theater burned down, and so the good people of Richmond decided they would gather their money. The leader of that committee was John Marshall, soon to be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who was there that night. And most of the leaders of the time were Episcopalians who was going to be an Episcopal church, so this provided a great opportunity. The Diocese of Virginia was going to gather for the first time. They were going to consecrate this church. They were going to elect a bishop. William Holland Wilmer presided. He was the president of the standing committee, presided at the service. He preached the dedication of the building, and in that sermon launched the theme, essentially. He talked about Virginia being the desolate Zion, and in our work was to revive and rebuild Zion. And so Richard Channing Moore was elected the rector of Monumental Church, so he had a salary, was elected the bishop, and then within 2 weeks' time, the General Convention was meeting, and he was consecrated. So things happened very quickly at that point in time. So this is a very pivotal moment, 1814. So essentially, the movement is launched then. So, and then, if that were not enough, our dear Dr. Wilmer published his book in 1815, the Episcopal Manual, which really is could be considered the first theologian of the American church. It's the first work of theology in the American church. It was published in 4 editions, and the last one 15 years after his death. It was really a field guide to this movement of building up the church, not only in Virginia, but in America. This piece of work became very broadly known and made Wilmer somewhat famous in America. So if that were not enough, he's the rector of St. Paul's Church. He's now the founding rector of St. John's Lafayette Square. He holds both positions at the same time and has Benjamin Henry Latrobe build that structure first. And then as this congregation grew, when that church was finished, he came back here and built this, helped lead having this church built. And again, in the small world department, Benjamin Henry Latrobe was not only the architect of these 2 churches, but he was the organist at St. Paul's, at St. John's Lafayette Square. So pretty amazing to think about that. So, a very busy man. If this weren't enough, though, the church is blossoming, growing, and they need more space. Remember, it's 1817, the church is built. A vast sum of $26,000 was spent. It was built within a year and consecrated. And this time, Bishop Richard Channing Moore was in place, and he came to consecrate the church. And this is a year, 1817, that William Holland Wilmer was also president of the House of Deputies, and he was put on the committee. He might have well have appointed himself to this committee of establishing a general seminary. He was very clear. There were 2 pieces of things that were very clear. He said the church was going to be revived through the pulpit and through education, and mostly the education of clergy. So he was on the board of the General Theological Seminary and remained on that board throughout his entire life in the same time while he was also developing a local seminary here. That's a whole nother story, an important one, but one to hold in mind, that he was so committed to education that he was working it on many, many fronts. It eventually became very clear, however, through lots of circumstances, that what the church needed really were regional seminaries, and that began yet another thing. He started and was the president of the Education Society, and this is in 1818. Let me give you the full name. It's precious. The Society for the Education of Pious Young Men for the Ministry of the Protestant Episcopal Church in Virginia and Maryland. he was its first president. So again, the idea here is to raise money and interest in a local seminary. And if this weren't enough, he started another tool for revival, and this is the Washington Theological Repertory Journal. He was the founder and chief editor and remained the chief editor until he left Alexandria in 1826. It's a monthly journal, originally thought to be just a sort of a regional way to connect evangelicals, and it became a national periodical. And again, this was another vehicle that Wilmer became known, not only within the church, but in the larger community. 1820, again, as the president of the House of Deputies, he was also became part of what became known as the Domestic and Foreign Missionary Society of the Church, which is the corporate name of the Episcopal Church even to this day. And I think the fascinating piece there is very clear that he was establishing a missionary society, not a church, that the work was in the world. And it's also in this year that he received his honorary doctorate from Brown University. And in that day, it really was an acknowledgement of his great academic acumen and all that he had given to the church. So it was as much a boost for Brown University as it was for Dr. Wilmer. And after that date, he became universally known as Dr. Wilmer. So there were two failed attempts at starting a local seminary. One idea was to revive the theological school at William and Mary. That failed. And then there was an attempt to start a school in D.C. with the Diocese of Maryland. Remember, Alexandria was part of the District of Columbia then. Dr. Wilmer was hired to come and start a school. We were all set to go, and then the Bishop of Maryland pulls out in spite of the fact of having students and funding. And so it was at that point that Dr. Wilmer said, okay, we'll just have the school here. So he started the Virginia Seminary on October 15th, 1823. We know that Wilmer was the first professor. He always volunteered. He was never paid. He was the professor through his whole time here until 1826, so 3 whole years. The hired professor was Reuel Keith, who was hired to revive the school at William and Mary. He was still relocating to Alexandria on October 15th. So we know that Dr. Wilmer got things rolling here, and soon they would form a partnership that would continue. Remember that the school quickly outgrew the space, and that building on the right was the original Wilmer Hall at the corner of Duke and South Pitt. Dr. Wilmer had that built in that year using his own money. The vestry essentially paid him back, but thought that we would need that space to grow educational space, not just for the seminary, but for the parish. They outgrew that, moved to the building at the southeast corner of King and Washington, which where the Banana Republic used to be. It became clear that was not because it was boarding and classroom space. One of the last things that Dr. Wilmer did before he left town was serve on a committee to select the new site of the Virginia Seminary, where it is today. So lots of deep history here. And getting the seminary established was really a great wall of rebuilding that foundation of the Virginia Zion. So, and then it is in 1826 that he leaves here because he's called to be the rector of Reuton Parish and the president of the College of William and Mary. It was a perfect match for Wilmer. He always loved the academic part of teaching, and also loved being, he thought the real front line of the revival of the church was the parish ministry and preaching. So this really did pair both of his loves. And I want to pause there just for a minute, just to give us a quick review the bidding. So he was a parish priest, growing local congregations. He was an active missionary, going on these missionary journeys, much like Paul, and starting new congregations. He helped lead and establish this new Episcopal Church in America. And remember that the Episcopal Church's development paralleled the development of the nation, which is really a bunch of regions trying to establish this national identity, and also to establish democratic principles. So the Episcopal Church would have very democratic governance structures. So, for instance, One of the things that happened is that in England, remember, bishops to this day are members of the House of Lords. They didn't want that to happen here. They wanted lay people and clergy to have a say, so they developed this new kind of way of being the Anglican Church in this new world. He wrote the Episcopal Manual, this field guide for evangelism. He established societies, many societies, and was part of doing this. I didn't mention this yet, but education societies, Bible societies, prayer book societies. Established the seminary. He was the first professor, and then, of course, the Washington Theological Repertory, this national journal. So in addition to all of this, he was married 3 times. He survived 2 spouses. His first marriage to Harriet Ringgold when they were in Chestertown. There are some reports that suggest they had 2 children that did not survive infancy, but Harriet died at the age of 19. He married a second time, Marion Hannah Cox. They had 6 children, and she died giving birth to her 6th child, and she was 25 years old when she died. His third wife, Anne Bryce Fitzhugh, was a member of St. Paul's, Alexandria, a very prominent family here in the parish. Their marriage could take up a whole nother forum. They had 2 children, and the issue there initially was that he was 41 and she was 22. It caused quite a stir in Alexandria. Okay, so we got the bidding. That's a lot. He's a very busy guy. So, William Holland Wilmer, this is I'm leading up to this. He died within a year after going to Williamsburg. So, he was 44 years old when he died, accomplished all of this amazing work. And he's eclipsed by his contemporaries. Soon after his death, he's pretty much forgotten. We have the Episcopal Manual, we have the Journal, we have 7 published sermons, or there were 7 published sermons. One's been lost, and we have 6. None of those things really have a lot of biographical information. And all of his personal letters, which there must have been thousands and thousands, only just a very few remain. And we don't even have a visage of him. This is all we have, this silhouette. There are no drawings, no paintings. We have this silhouette. But blessedly, there is enough to piece together his story. So let's quickly move to looking at the state of the church in Virginia at Wilmer's time. Just a quick overview of what's happening there. Desolate Zion. And maybe one way a stat that sticks in my head is that before the Revolutionary War, there were 250 Church of England congregations in Virginia. Remember, Virginia was all of Virginia, all the way to the Ohio River. So big expanse. Of those, only 35 remain today. Okay, so think about that. So it's difficult to overstate how bad things were in those days. We certainly have these national issues. Being the Church of England after fighting a war of independence is a huge PR problem. How are you going to overcome that? How do you develop this national identity out of all of these conflicting regional identities? How do you create the mechanisms for self-government that will work, that will reflect these ideals of the revolution? And frankly, people know that we needed bishops in the Episcopal Church to function. We needed them, but they didn't particularly want them. So there was this conflict, particularly in Virginia and in the South. They wanted to keep the connection to these Anglican roots, but they also wanted to maintain some distance. It was precarious times. In Virginia, things were just compounded. It was the perfect storm. So even after independence, the church continued to be associated with the hated aristocracy. This vestry system that was established was self-perpetuating. They were all white, they were all men, they were all wealthy. People would look at them and think, this is exactly why we fought a war. Why would we ever go to this church? And remember, the vestry was a legal arm, not just ran the parish, but ran the municipality. So there was lots of tension there. There was problems about being the established church. Being the established church in Virginia meant that the General Assembly regulated church life. There were lots of conflicts even before the independence. And then disestablishment meant There was no tax funds to support the church, and the glebes were taken away. Those 200 acres that survived, that were set aside to help pay the salaries of ministers. Many of them started schools. Many of them leased it away to other farmers to help supplement their income. All of that was taken away. And then, not to be also forgotten, is that there's a rise of all these other denominations. There was this second Great Awakening happening, and that was very devastating to the church in Virginia, mostly the separation of when it was decided that the Methodists would become their own church, their own denomination. Remember, that was a movement within Anglicanism, and some of the best people in the congregation were Methodists and ended up leaving. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there was this rise in deism. And it was mostly male, aristocratic, wealthy folks who did this. And again, many of them, sort of like today, didn't see any conflict between being an Anglican and a deist. They thought it was all just fine. And it really diminished the church. So what was left of the church was mostly women and mostly children. So Zion was at its lowest ebb, and many were writing its obituary. So let's shift to life today. The present generation of the Episcopal Church finds itself confronted with its own Zion-building moment. Not unlike the unwelcome chaos and confusion unleashed by disestablishment, today's church is in the midst of its own identity crisis. The church is again forced to reinvent itself. Along with other mainline Christian denominations, there has been a marked and steady decline in membership and attendance. Some of you were at a forum some weeks ago, and we showed the video from the VTS tri-tank experiment, and the takeaway for me was that the average attendance on a Sunday morning in Episcopal Church is 40 people, and those 40 people currently are average 70 years old, and they make the point that in 10 years they'll be 80 if there's still 40 there. So the prevailing culture is also less open and more skeptical of religious institution. And the percentage of those embracing other religions continue to rise, but not as fast as those who profess no religion at all. As for the church, the forces of inertia and the exhausting efforts to try to maintain the status quo make it hard to even imagine, much less work toward a different reality. The old funding models no longer work. Fewer and fewer congregations are able to afford full-time clergy, and many are either closing or barely hanging on. This has prompted many creative responses and has sharpened the need for more vocationally flexible and entrepreneurial church leaders. Episcopal seminaries have also had their troubles. Economic pressures have prompted a parallel response. Some have closed and transferred all their assets to another institution. Others have become largely virtual, giving up a physical campus. Some others have merged and have consolidated with larger, stronger, healthier seminaries and academic institutions, like what's happening with VTS and General Seminary today. Bishops and dioceses struggle under the weight of bureaucratic responsibilities. They must cope with the pressure of declining revenues from diminished and diminishing congregations. They grapple with the question of how to best address the shifting landscape, clarify their role, and lead toward a more hopeful future. Add this to the external factors of a global pandemic, a multitude of vexing social and cultural issues, all magnified by political polarization, and it is easy to succumb to the voices that again predict the demise of the Episcopal Church. As in the past, some are writing its obituary. So, WWWD, what would Wilmer do? Wilmer's primary resources were the Bible and the Book of Common Prayer, with the Bible being the ultimate standard by which everything else was judged. And the prayer book for him provided a dual purpose. First, it contained within its covers not only the liturgy of the church, but also the catechism and the articles of religion, which provide the foundational material for theological thinking. Second, the prayer book reinforced the pattern of private and corporate worship. Private and corporate worship. For him, worship was unrivaled as a means of Christian formation. Worship was how the theology of the church was learned, and our theology is informed by our worship. One of the reasons that Wilmer was so keen to lead and support Bible and prayer book societies was to get these two primary resources into people's hands, distributing the Word of God and the much more user-friendly version of that Word, the Book of Common Prayer, could help reflect those Reformation principles and practices that he hoped to promote. It would also prove an effective way in enlisting others in this great movement of his. Faced with this set of circumstances, what would he do? We don't know for certain, but we can, with some speculation, follow his well-established pattern. In his introduction to the Episcopal Manual, he invites readers to avoid the two extremes and embrace a more Anglican perspective. He reminds his readers not to forget the traditions of the church. That is his critique of Protestant denominations. They forgot the tradition or forgetful about the traditions of the church, and not to be focused too much on the externals, which is his critique of Catholicism. In short, he believed that the church already holds the truths that are needed for its restoration and renewal. He also believed that spending too much time on non-essentials was counterproductive. He wanted to focus on people, relationships, and engagement. This understanding compelled Wilmer to be actively engaged with those who had fallen away from the church, those who professed other Christian and non-Christian perspectives, or those who were he would talk to anyone who was open to talk to him. Two things seemed paramount for Wilmer in this engagement. First was restraint. He was motivated by a spirit of charity. He always tried to act in humility. He was always aware of his own limitations, fully aware that God's thoughts and ways were not equivalent to his thoughts and ways. Secondly, however, his humility did not lead him to promote an amorphous, kind of all-inclusive understanding of faith. To the contrary, as we have seen, he was an Orthodox Christian and had incredibly high standards for what it was to be an Orthodox Christian. For Wilmer, this combination of genuine openness with complete, absolute personal clarity, extending grace, but also holding core principles, was the pattern that he would use over and over and over again. At this point, I'm letting you in on a secret. And this will be very familiar to you, and I'm not putting these words in Wilmer's mouth, but this will look familiar to you. 5 aspirations for St. Paul's. I believe that these they're congruent with the work that he did, to help encourage people to pray, daily conversations with God, and corporate worship. We are people who pray. We are people who keep the Sabbath. We come to worship. We are people who learn. We're engaged in our own faith development, which is ongoing. We're a people of service. We serve in the world. We are people who give of ourselves. I think these would surely delight our ancestor, Wilmer. So these five aspirational tenets of faith point to the 2 classic perspectives which Wilmer would recognize. The first is the concept of moral agency. Unlike the extreme Protestant and Catholic positions which prescribe moral behavior and belief, Anglicans have always held, to varying degrees, the idea that individuals should make and think and act for themselves. The church provides formation and information, yet the decision belongs to the people. And the result, of course, of this kind of thinking is the reality that 2 people can read the same Bible passages, hear the same sermons, worship consistently in the same community, and have 2 very different perspectives. And we support that. But it leads for a rather messy existence and a stumbling block for those who seek absolutism and clarity for their direction. Sometimes it's just simply easier to be told what to do and how to believe rather than assuming personal responsibility. This leads to the second closely related concept, and it's been repeated several times, this via media, the Anglican parlance for the constant search for common ground, a middle way between extreme positions, trying to find the best of both and holding together, not seeking the lowest common denominator, but working toward providing a greater truth. Wilmer loved this tradition, utilized its resources to great effect. He was able to persuade many to follow his understanding of how to live a faithful life, and he was able to help discover a middle way that would allow a national church to acquire a new identity and for the Episcopal Church in Virginia to be reborn. He learned the hard way, however, that when it came to reckoning with institutional slavery, there was no middle ground upon which to stand. It was non-existent. Through it all, Wilmer never lost faith and never lost hope in the Episcopal Church. He believed that the American expression of the Anglican tradition had a unique, important, and much-needed voice to add to the religious landscape. Today, that mission is ours. Thank you.